Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. In this episode, we are going to conclude our discussion on Jericho, so if you guys haven't already, I should like to encourage you to watch that video first before watching this video. Now, if you have watched that video, here's what we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss the stratigraphy, the Scarab evidence, and the radiocarbon dating at the site of Jericho, and how it fits not only a late Exodus date, but also how it undermines the early Exodus date. So if you guys haven't already, I should like to encourage you to hit that like button and subscribe in order to receive future notifications on any videos I may upload. And as always, I will list my sources in the description below. First up, stratigraphy. Now, if you guys are not familiar with stratigraphy, the simple definition of it, or stratigraphy, is the branch of geology that deals with rock successions, which allows archaeologists and historians to date a particular site. Moreover, we start counting from the bottommost layers, working our way upwards. So let's say, for example, that we have a city that has 6 layers of stratigraphy. Then we would start counting at the lowest layer, 1, 2, 3, counting upwards, 4, 5, 6, numerically. Usually, archaeologists will use words and phrases such as destruction layers to describe what may have happened at a particular layer. As with the site in question here, Jericho has several layers of stratigraphy. More specifically for our concerns here, we can narrow it down to 2 layers of which are most important: Jericho 4 and Jericho 5. Here's a mini excursus, though. It was Kathleen Kenyon who advocated something called a stratification process or analysis. That is to say that she taught that strata should be separated and numbered, and that interfaces between deposits of stratigraphic or stratigraphic excavation, which had previously been ignored, should be taken into account. Today, archaeologists follow her standard, which is why Jericho is the way it is, a hot mess. Not because of Kathleen Kenyon, I should like to admit, but because of poor excavation practices prior to Kenyon, as well as the elements, that is to say, erosion and stuff. Now, I already mentioned these 2 layers in my last video, but what is interesting for our purposes in this video is what archaeologists have found at each of these layers, namely pottery. Now, I know, I can already hear you guys saying, we went over the pottery already, but hear me out. This will all come together nicely in the end. So, Dr. Bryant Wood, whom we discussed in the previous video, and who has excavated at Tel Es Sultan, argues that the bichrome pottery found at the site should be redated to the late Bronze period, rather than the Middle Bronze period, arguing against Kenyon's dating of 1550 BCE. Wood states, however, that Garstang found a considerable quantity of pottery decorated with red and black paint, which appears to be imported Cypriot biochrome ware, the type of pottery Kenyon was looking for, but did not find. Here is an example of Cypriot biochrome ware, which is one of the major diagnostic indicators for occupation in the late Bronze I period, according to Wood. But as I already stated, though, Wood seems to cling to John Garstang on the dating of the pottery, unfortunately. This guy. The problem here, though, is that the pottery at the site is more than likely not Cypriot biochrome pottery. It's not Cypriot, as Bienkowski argues in his article that we touched upon last week's video, and we will continue to discuss in this one. Wood is not only mistaken with the biochrome pottery, though. He seems to conflate the Middle Bronze Age layers, as well as thinking there are subdivisions of the Middle Bronze Age. Wood divides them into Middle Bronze 2 and 3, and furthermore, Wood refers to Kenyon's Phase 32 as the beginning of Middle Bronze 3 at Jericho, starting at around 1650 BCE, and argues for the implausibility, I mind you, of squeezing the following 20 phases into a mere 100 years. This is simply unnecessary and unwarranted. Elsewhere, Bienkowski has argued that it is difficult to divide the period between 1800 and 1550 BCE in Palestine into 2 parts, Middle Bronze 2 and Middle Bronze 3. Wood is wrong, though, in citing certain pottery types as diagnostic of Middle Bronze 3. There are no forms accepted as diagnostic of Middle Bronze 3. At Jericho, the analysis of the pottery shows that there is no justification of any subdivision. Similarly, no major stratigraphic or stratigraphic break can be discerned at Jericho, which might correlate with the Middle Bronze 2 or 3 subdivision. Thus, Wood's attempt to fix this fictional break quite confidently at phase 32 is simply misinformation. I agree, therefore, with Binkowski that squeezing so many data into 100 years is not only implausible, but also improbable. Next up, we've got scarabs. Although a minor argument among scholars who advocate for either an early date exodus or a late date exodus, scarab evidence can be invaluable. Now, we mentioned the Scarab of Amenhotep III in the first video, but there is more on scarab evidence at the site. Furthermore, there is also more than just one scarab that has been discovered at Jericho. In addition to the Scarab of Amenhotep III, we also have scarabs that belong to Pharaohs Thutmose III, shown here, and Hatshepsut, indicating an Egyptian presence in the area during the 15th century BCE. Moreover, Bienkowski argues that scarabs of well-known 18th dynasty kings were very common and could remain in circulation or even be manufactured long after the kings themselves had died. Wood does concede that the scarabs of Amenhotep III and Thutmose III were heirlooms. However, he argues that Hatshepsut, her scarab pictured here, is different because the queen was not revered like the previous kings. Therefore, her scarab can function as a chronological marker for the site. On the contrary, Wood suggests that Hatshepsut was maligned and her name systematically obliterated from monuments and inscriptions as a result of her scarabs were not kept as good luck charms or heirlooms, seemingly suggesting that the cemetery at Jericho showed activity throughout the 15th century. Although I have no problem with Wood's conclusion that the cemetery remained active during the 15th century, the cemetery certainly was not active after the 15th century. Ergo, I do find his conclusion unconvincing or lacking in that we should not use these scarabs as pieces for dating, or at least with Hatshepsut, and choosing rather to side with Bienkowski on this issue. It is simply unnecessary, and I do mean unnecessary, to redate the destruction at Jericho from 1550 to 1440. Finally, we've got radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating has been a wonderful tool for archaeologists since the 1940s. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that Wood and Bienkowski use it to date the artifacts and site themselves. Furthermore, as far as evidence at Jericho is concerned, supporting for either the early or late date exodus, this too is a minor argument, however invaluable the information gleaned from it can be. In his field report, Bienkowski noted that a C14 date of 1410 BCE for the MBA, or Middle Bronze Age, building level site H stage 12 implies an LBA location, Late Bronze Age location, which does not occur in site H until stage 14 on the evidence of the phase. I want to say this was 14, I'm not sure, I'm sorry, but his field report was a bit difficult to read, at least at this point. And its material remains that there may have been contamination of stage 12 from an L late bronze levels by the destruction of a floor in a stage 12 room by a sounding from Garstang's excavations. Wood argues, however, that it is rather unlikely that such a contamination happened, citing that Kenyon was digging a layer of severely burnt debris from the destruction of the Bronze Age city as much as 3 feet thick. Wood continues to say that this debris included collapsed roof beams, a hearth surrounded by a thick spread of charcoal, and quantity of charred sticks. Seemingly, Wood uses Kenyon only when it suits him, implying that Kenyon would never make such a mistake in her meticulous fieldwork. I must admit here that Wood seems to shoehorn this piece of evidence, or piece of charcoal, to the 15th century because he simply sees what he wants to see. No archaeologist or historian is buying his argument here when it comes not only to the radiocarbon dating, but the pottery as well. Another study, though, was conducted using radiocarbon dating at the site, as well by Hendrik Browns and Johannes van der Pleyt. What is interesting is that one of these samples, out of 18, was charcoal found at the tell. Normally, in this area, tamarisk trees are predominant, which is where the charcoal originated. No surprises there. So, the charcoal yielded a somewhat older average, but led to more precise dating according to their study. What allows for a lack of precise dating, though, are the calibration curves, which translated the precise BP dates into wide ranges of historical years. Browns and van der Plijt took 10 charcoal pieces, which resulted in a dating around the 17th or 16th centuries, thereby contradicting Wood's theory that the destruction layer should be in 1450 BCE, rather than 1550, as proposed by Kenyon. With this information, though, it would seem that the radiocarbon dating does not necessarily support a late date exodus, but rather goes against the early date exodus, or Wood's theory that the destruction layer at Jericho is 1450 BCE, but rather more in line with Kenyon's destruction layer in the 16th century, or 1550 BCE. In conclusion, the evidence seems to align with the late date exodus in the stratigraphy, as well as undermining the early date exodus, where the pottery does not belong in the late Bronze Age, better fitting again with the middle Bronze Age, at least as far as the pottery is concerned. Furthermore, Scarab evidence does demonstrate that the cemetery at Jericho was in use throughout the 15th century, but not after the 15th century. And the scarabs of Thutmose III and Amenhotep III are better understood as heirlooms or good luck charms, no matter Wood's stake on the scarab of Hatshepsut. Finally, radiocarbon dating, or C14 dating at the site, seemingly supports a late date exodus based on a slight mistake by Kenyon and the work of Browns and van der Plijt, who argued that charcoal is better suited for the late Middle Bronze Age. And that's it, folks. That's all I've got. And that will conclude this week's installment and analysis on the archaeology at the city of Jericho. So I hope you enjoyed this, and as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and finally let me know your thoughts on Jericho, whether you're a late date exodus proponent or an early date exodus proponent, in the comments below. Until next time, guys.